Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Laura Tarantini-Amor, and I'm an EAL and SEND consultant, and I'll be talking about expanding access to education for EAL and SEND children. So we're going to be discussing context, we're going to be discussing trips and tips, and looking at increasing that access. All right, so a little bit about me first. Again, my name is Laura Tarantini-Amor. I've been a teacher in this country for 24 years. I am a consultant, and so I work with across about 33 secondary schools in London. My background is as a Spanish teacher for 24 years. I'm a SENCO, I'm a specialist assessor, all sorts of experience to be talking to you about today. So why are there a growing number of EAL and SEND children that have those crossover needs? What are the differences between those needs, and how do they intersect, and what can we do about it as educators and teachers? Well, first of all, how many kids are we talking about here? The DFE's most recent data suggests that about 15% of kids are SEN nationally. It also suggests that about 29% of children in this country at this point are bilingual. A lot of schools find that's an average, so it's more than that. So for some reason, in some schools, there might be up to 65%, 75, 80% bilingual children there. In other schools, there might also be up to 30, 35% SEN. So this is just an average. In terms of a crossover, we have approximately 8% of children are also considered SEND and EAL. And then we just explained that SEND, as you guys know, is special educational needs and disabilities. EAL is English as an additional language. So that is children that are bilingual in more than one language, could be any one of a number of languages. I've met children who speak up to 9 languages. That has increased over the past 10 years. As you guys probably are aware, SEND is increasing and EAL is increasing. So in terms of the growth of EAL pupils, over the past 10 years or so, so in 2014, 18.5% of pupils in England were reported as having EAL. By last year or so, by 2023, that figure had risen to 21%, so that approximately 1.6 million pupils in this country today speak a different language, and they're identified as being bilingual. That's a 2% growth, but again, that growth is uneven, so some areas of the country are going to have a much bigger growth than that. The regional variation does tend to center around larger cities, and the bilingualism in the larger cities does change. So for some cities like perhaps Manchester, for example, maybe Bradford, you'll have bilingualism that's in in a few language categories, or you'll have places like London where you have maybe 17 languages in the classroom. You might have 86 different languages spoken at one particular school. So, that's going to be different to maybe a countryside area or less urban area that maybe has just a few kids. But again, those few kids might come from a number of different areas. Schools may have as many as 10 different languages in the classroom, even though they don't have a lot of EAL children on register. Okay, so in terms of the crossover, again, we're talking about 8% of those students. So where is that particularly coming from? So there are factors that are affecting the increase in the EAL children. Migration is one of them. The UK has experienced significant migration over the past decade, particularly with children from a wide range of countries, post-EU Brexit, the Middle East and Asia joining us. Refugee and asylum-seeking children. Now, not a lot of people are talking about refugee and asylum-seeking children. There are quite a lot of them in the country. At this point in time, there are about 100,000 families who are seeking asylum here in the UK, and many of them bring with them school-age children. Many of our cities in the more deprived areas, if they're near resettlement hotels, they will be getting a number of those kids, to the point where sometimes you'll have a primary school which is as much as 10% of its entire pupil cohort might become from refugee and asylum seeking. Resettlement schemes such as the Syrian refugee resettlement, Afghan relocation and assistance has brought a lot of people. Of course, the war in the Ukraine is another one. So the impact on schools has been that you've had a huge increase recently, and certainly over the past 10 years, but in the past 2 years, you've had a real uptick in bilingual children from various backgrounds coming into UK schools. And so that has meant with it come certain problems that those children bring with them. There are also benefits, but in terms of EAL and SEND, that's an area of concern. So in terms of the impact, all right. Another thing that isn't talked about too much is the age of the children coming through. So when you're talking about EAL children, if you're talking about asylum and refugee-seeking children, a lot of kids are now the age of 16 and over, and so you have colleges who were not looking at that kind of population previously, who now are. You have colleges who are trying to find programs for children who are academic, who've had a really fantastic academic education. For instance, kids from Ukraine, who don't have the sort of problems that come from when kids come from places where they don't have established educational systems. And those children are finding it really difficult because colleges are used to having children come to them who have already been through their GCSEs. So about 17% of the kids coming through at the moment are 16 to 18 years old, and they're interested in further and higher education, and they need help getting in there. So colleges and universities are now also dealing with a level of bilingualism that they didn't necessarily have before, and not necessarily through an international student sort of route. Alrighty, so we have all of those things that are impacting. Okay, now the problem becomes schools are trying to deal with the needs. They have to tell the difference between what is a learning need and what is a language need, and the children coming with both. Well, first of all, you need to know the normal progress that a child makes when they're learning an additional language. You need to know what cultural differences have. So, for instance, there might be some children that come from cultures where you don't look a grown-up in the eye, and UK teachers might see that as being a sign of social communication issues. For SEND, you need to know whether or not the assessments that are going to be done by professionals are actually useful for EAL children. So, for instance, you might have an EAL child that you might think has a special educational need, and you call a speech and language therapist, or you call an educational psychologist, and that professional, and you're paying them, and that professional actually can't use their diagnostic tools because those tools are not appropriate for EAL children. Or your school wants to go for an education healthcare plan, and they need standardized scores, and those professionals can't use those because those tests are not normed on EAL children. So again, these are some of the difficulties that schools come with in terms of trying to widen the access. And how long do you wait before a child is exposed to English before you decide that you're going to put them through some sort of diagnostic assessment? Some speech and language therapists will wait until a child has been in the country at least 2 years, and that's mostly at primary school. Research tells us is that the brain acquires a second language or an additional language within 5 to 7 years and have the exam proficiency there. When the children come through, generally, when I'm talking children, I'm a secondary school teacher, they're all kids to me, but we're talking primary and secondary. So sometimes children will have a silent period where they don't speak because they're just listening for 6 months. And then after about 2 years or so, they have more functional language, and you can begin to see maybe some of the features, the learning features that that child has behind their need to learn English or to learn another language. But the problem that we have in our educational system is that we don't have the time. We don't have the time to wait until these children acquire enough English to figure out whether or not they have a special educational need. So part of expanding the access is trying to speed up their acquisition so that not only are they making progress in our school system, but we're also figuring out whether or not they might have some other type of need that we need to help them with. Okay, so let's start to break down language acquisition. Testing it, measuring it, planning for it. The language acquisition process is really interesting because the brain learns language through social means. In other words, humans are designed to acquire language because it is a social tool. So these children cannot be isolated. They have to be included in other activities. And once they're included in other activities, they have a reason to pick up the language that they need. So they will start with hello, how are you, my name is, etc. The second layer that they need is acquiring language that comes from an academic context. So that's one of the reasons why in schools, in-class support is useful, but also unstructured time support is useful because those kids are playing with others, they're developing friendships, they're figuring out how to say, I want to play football with you, etc. So they have the everyday language. In classrooms, teachers need to think about how to keep their language the same. So you should have a routine, and teachers should have some sort of idea of how many types of things they ask children to do. Do they ask them to raise their hands? Do they ask them to tuck their chairs in? Do they ask them to open their notebooks, etc.? You probably have about 10 to 15 things that you're asking children to do on a daily basis over and over again. And if you're aware of those sorts of task instructions, you can start to train EAL children in understanding that. And then they start to gallop along. So children, once they get that little bit of language, they then start to pick it up in chunks, and they pick it up in functional chunks. And that makes sense because if you're learning language to go to another country, you don't pick up a book on grammar. You take on tourist phrases, right? Because the brain thinks that for this interaction, for this situation, I need that chunk of language. Okay, and EAL children tend to speed up, so they start slow. And then they speed up later on as they start to take on more and more language. Because the more that you understand, the more that you can understand. All right. So that's a language acquisition progress. The timeline, again, at secondary school, when we have kids that come into Key Stage 4, it's really difficult because that's a GCSE year. The UK is an age-based system. So if you're 15, whether you've been educated or not, you have to go into year 10. And you have to start being prepared for your GCSEs, which means a huge amount of pressure on that child and on teachers. Okay, the number of words that child is able to acquire is also limited because there's only certain ways in which the brain works. So, for instance, if I wanted to go to the University of Stockholm in Sweden and I was given an intelligence test before they let me into a master's degree, I would come out as significantly learning disabled because I don't have a basic 5,000 word vocabulary that a 5-year-old Swedish child would. We tend to conflate a lack of language with a lack of intelligence. And that's understandable because there's a big, connection between cognition and language. I often tell teachers that the biggest problem is not whether or not a child learns English or not, or knows English or not. The biggest problem for us is whether or not that child has been previously educated. If a child has not been previously educated, then they're learning a whole host of other things that don't necessarily have to do with the curriculum. So they're learning how an institution works. They're learning how a large institution organizes people. When that bell goes, you have to be this place. You have to go to this classroom. You have to sit in this chair. You have to wear this. All of those things can be really random unless you are used to an educational system that does that. And while a child is learning how to focus themselves and how to manage themselves within your building, they're not necessarily picking up language. So sometimes that can come across as a special educational need. Most children will be acquiring language fairly quickly. The reason that speech and language therapists think that a child should be around for about 2 years is because within 2 years, most kids will have acquired enough language to be able to be tested in one thing or another. Okay. Another thing is access to healthcare. So you will have EAL children who are able to pick up and learn English, but because they haven't had access to healthcare in their early years, they might have hearing issues. They might have sight issues. They might have things that have never been picked up, which are impacting on their ability to develop English properly. And again, sometimes teachers might mistake that as an SEN. Our EAL pupils tend to surpass monolingual pupils if they have come to the country early enough. So whether or not a bilingual child has hit the educational system in primary school has a big impact. So if they've come in primary school, they've come in Key Stage 2, generally they've learned enough language to actually surpass native-born monolingual pupils by the time they get to Key Stage 4. And nationally, EAL pupils have a higher grade, higher level of grades than monolinguals do if they manage to come early enough. Now, for the type of kids that we have been talking about, the migrants and the refugees, that's not always the case. You have kids coming directly into the system in Key Stage 4, and you have very little time to actually teach them English, okay? Appropriate input. Appropriate input is another one. If a child has not been taught English, if you're expecting them to pick it up, they're not going to learn fast enough. And if they can't learn fast enough, some of your teachers might think, oh, there's a learning problem here. Not necessarily the case. English is not a regular language. The language that I speak at home, which is Spanish, and many of the languages that are out there walking around are regular languages. English is a mashup of about 7 different languages. And so as soon as you learn the rule for something, you have to unlearn it for another word. Most children will be able to pick up regular past tense, ed, walked, walked, etc. That's a Latin-based rule. But there are also French-based rules and there are German-based rules that mean that, children have to constantly learn what's the exception to the rule. And again, most of them will pick up a rule and they will try to apply it inappropriately across a very uneven language. So again, that is not about them having a learning disability or having any difficulty with them. That's about the fact that English is not a regular language and needs to be taught explicitly. So, in terms of speeding up acquisition, kids do get faster if we have the right strategies in the classroom. And that's where we'll talk about expanding access. So when you're looking at technology, when you're looking at the use of technology, you're looking at the use of visuals primarily. Visuals and kinesthetic learning. And what I mean by kinesthetic learning is not necessarily that you get the kids to do something, although that's a good thing, but that because language is socially placed, children will pick up the language they need to from the activities in the classroom. I have always said to senior leadership team at my schools that actually children don't learn English in English classrooms because English classrooms are about English as a subject. It's not about English as the language. And so the best place for an EAL child to learn English is in your design and technology. It's in your drama. It's in PE, where they're doing something and they're learning what the verb is that goes along with that. So when they're in that kind of environment, it's easier for them to pick up the language. Teachers can make it a lot easier for EAL children when they give high-level vocabulary and short sentences. Okay? Tier 3 words, which are the words that we use across our subjects, so things like hyperbole or photosynthesis, etc., are really easy for kids to pick up. They're absolutely easy. Those are things that are universal words because they usually have a Latin, Greek, Arabic, French, or German root, and actually they translate really easily. What's not so easy are the smaller words, what we call the tier 2 or the tier 1 words. Words like through, words like about, words like one, as in the number, not actually winning. Those are really difficult words because you can't sound those out. Those are sight words. They're called sight words in English because English-speaking children learn how to pronounce them from just looking at them. That's what we need to get the input on. So it's not about simplifying the words that we use necessarily. Again, EAL children can learn those higher level words. What they can't do is put them in very long sentences as of yet. So I will teach the word photosynthesis, but I will teach them the sentence, this is. This is photosynthesis. It is a groin. So I keep the sentences short, but I keep the words, the actual key words that they have to use, longer. Then we talk about building sentence length. The GCSEs tend to look at length of sentence, certainly for GCSE English, for GCSE English literature and language. When you're talking about science papers, for instance, some science papers want bullet points, some science papers want full sentences. How do you build the length of sentences for children? You build it by giving them the big words in a short sentence. Then you teach them connectives. You teach them and, but, although, so that you can actually have compound sentences, obviously 2 simple sentences glued together. And then you teach them a series of complex blueprints. So when this happens, this happens. So when the if sentences are really good, teaching children about commas. When you have a complex sentence is when you have a comma, right? Or when you have an embedded clause. So teaching children how to use at least one type of complex sentence, maybe a second type of complex sentence, and then suddenly you have single sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences. Pretty soon you get that child writing in paragraphs. So if you understand that as a teacher for EAL children, you need to put the language to the forefront, and not about not giving them the big words. It's about giving them the words, but making the sentences shorter. You open up access to them. Where EdTech is useful is where a lot of those words, a lot of those higher level words are actually concrete nouns or concrete processes. And that's where you can use something like Immersive Reader to show the picture. Okay? I can teach a child who speaks any language photosynthesis, one, because I can translate that word, two, because I can show them a picture for it. And as soon as you give them the picture, the brain either knows the picture because they've been previously educated and they're pulling from academic concepts they've had earlier, and then you're hanging the language on the hook of the concept. If you do it the other way around, let me tell you what photosynthesis is, and then maybe I'll show you a picture, that's not going to work. But it's not going to work. It will work eventually, but it won't work fast enough to get these kids the level of language that we need to get them through the educational system. And again, if we're not teaching them fast enough, at some point along their career, we're going to think maybe there's a learning need here, when actually it's been an inappropriate or just incomplete use of language acquisition techniques. So visuals are really important. Teachers understanding the amount of language that they use and keeping that language similar so that that language can be recycled. It's something that I do as a language teacher. I can teach a child how to say any kind of opinion, but what I need to do is keep the opinion part, the me gusta, I like, similar, and then we start to change the vocabulary. It's the same process when you're talking about learning English. Okay, so we talked about the language acquisition process for EAL kids. What then happens if you think that there is a learning difficulty for someone who's had appropriate input, but who's not making the progress that you think they should have? Okay, so we're going to talk about that sort of diagnostic process. Okay. First of all, we have to talk about what's different about special educational needs. English as additional language is a linguistic process. It's a cultural process. This is not about a neurological difficulty or an organic difficulty. When you are talking about a learning difficulty, you're talking about some sort of organic process, which really usually is about processing. It's about, for example, if you're talking about dyslexia, you're talking about whether or not the brain can take a sound that it gets from either Broca's area or Wernicke's area and pull it together with the visual of a letter. If it can pull together, if your executive function can pull together the sound with a visual, you can learn what a word is. That's not really what EAL children are dealing with, okay? For those people that have difficulty with that connection, with that process, the brain learns how to do it, but the brain learns how to do it in a different way, potentially a less effective way, and so that child becomes slower. But the processing comes from executive function difficulties that have trouble pulling information from different parts of the brain that are processing different parts of the information. So again, you're talking about the occipital lobe, where visuals are processed, Wernicke and Broca's area, where language is processed, and of course the executive function that pulls it all together, and the memory bits where you have short-term and long-term memory. If you have executive function problems, there's all sorts of difficulties. The reason that we talk about neurodiversity and the range of neurodiverse issues is because it comes very much from the same source. Where you have an executive function problem that can't pull together the different processes of the brain, or pulls together one more strongly than the other, then you have a gap. So for instance, for autism, you might have kids who are able to really focus on details, but they can't connect it laterally because lateral connections tend to be emotional connections for us. When we develop semantic webs of words, we develop feelings and associations with them that those children may not have developed, okay? So that's one part of it. When you're talking about dyslexia, that's neurodiverse because you have a neurology that's not pulling together the sound and the shape of the letter and then the memory of the word. When you're talking about speech and language issues, you're talking about language processing issues. Again, you're talking about children who can't quite pull together what a word is with the things it's associated with, where you use it. And language processing issues have to deal with a number of different areas like that, where I might know what the word is and I might be able to associate with something with it, but I'm not sure in what situation I use it in, and so I use it incorrectly. When you're talking about mild learning difficulties, or MLD as they're called in this country, just to let people know, sometimes schools are a bit free with the MLD label. Mild learning difficulty is a medical diagnosis that only an educational psychologist can make. We often get, and this is from my own experience, where you have well-meaning primary schools who see that a child is having trouble across literacy and numeracy. Sometimes they label a child MLD. That label then is not investigated. It follows that child up through secondary, and then you have a child who's probably bilingual, who came into Key Stage 2 learning English, who now has a special needs label brought with them. Because in this country, numeracy is actually literacy-based. The foundation GCSE has more word problems than it has actually numerical problems on it. And if you can't deal with the language, you can't do math. It's not the same in other countries. It's not the same, okay? So some of the other things are, I talked about speech and language needs. Trauma. Trauma is a huge one. Where you have a number, like I said, there are 100,000 families now seeking asylum or resettlement in the UK. Those people come with them with trauma. And trauma affects how language is acquired, even in a normal child. One of the reasons why someone like me exists, why we have SEND and EAL pulled together as a kind of a series of things to explore it in cohesion, is because you have more and more children who are coming to this country whose special educational need is trauma. And the trauma that affects language acquisition and normal language acquisition in kids who would otherwise normally acquire language. So where the brain has suffered trauma, where there has been emotional trauma, other types of trauma, physical trauma, the brain is busy processing that and is not necessarily going to grab those bits of language, even with the social kind of push that comes from come to school, make some friends, get involved, play at lunchtime. That the brain is still working on all those other things. And so again, it's not exactly a special educational need. It's a bit of a slowness in acquiring a language, but because of the depth of the trauma sometimes that does become a special educational need. And just to say that special educational needs are measured, or they're talked about in relation to everybody else. So you have a special educational need. Sometimes it comes with a diagnosis. Sometimes it comes with a general comparison about you against the rest of the population. So actually, something that's really interesting, I'm beginning to question special educational needs as a term, because if the majority of the population has a certain amount of trauma, has a certain amount of lack of a language experience because of COVID, doesn't that suddenly become the norm? Don't we have so many more kids here whose norm may have been considered special educational needs before? Neurodiversity as a concept now is becoming a lot more widespread. So is that a special educational need? If those children are becoming much more of the norm, then who is special in relation to those kids must be changing. We must be talking about more and more sort of extreme organic needs. So again, I think that that's a conversation. What's special in terms of an educational need? Okay, hyperactivity. Hyperactivity, in terms of the H that's in ADHD, is an interesting one as well, because attention deficit is its own thing. It means that there is an executive function issue where you can't focus your attention, you can't zero in on stuff. Hyperactivity along with that, or hyperactivity without attention deficit, is kind of its own animal. Sometimes that's about impulsivity. Sometimes that's about the executive function not being able to tell the rest of the brain, why don't we think before we do this? I'm sure there are grown-ups that have that issue. But sometimes, and the reason it's considered part of neurodiversity is that it has a neurological component to it. It's a part of the proprioceptive nervous system. The proprioceptive nervous system is what happens below the brain, where your body tells your brain where it is in space. There are a lot of ADHD kids that have a misfire in that system. And so actually they have to keep a part of their body moving to tell their brain where they are in space. That's not an excess of energy, and that's not impulsivity. That's literally them having to signal to the brain where they are in space. And when you don't know where your body is, and you're slightly disoriented all the time, that kind of takes your attention, doesn't it? When you have EAL children who have a level of attention difficulty, it isn't necessarily an SEN. Again, you have children in this country who have come in with trauma. They've got memories going on. They may not be sleeping. So you have children who can't necessarily focus their attention on your language acquisition. You don't necessarily need to label them ADHD. You kind of need to give them some mental health support. If they have the mental health support and they have support normalizing the sense of making peers, then the language acquisition starts to come on a bit more quickly, and it's not necessarily has to be labeled as a special educational need for those children to get some help. Okay, so far we've talked about what is EAL, what's the language acquisition process. We've talked about SEND and those things that happen both neurologically and organically. We've talked about what I would call kind of a situational educational need, which is where you have trauma because it's been about an experience. And again, you don't need to be a refugee for them to have experience. So in terms of the crossover, we'll start to talk about maybe some strategies. Okay, so what do we do? We know we have these children. We know we have SEND and EAL children. We know that 8% of the children in the country have a crossover need where they are both considered to have a special educational need and are also bilingual. What do we do? What do we do in our classrooms? So what I used to say as a Senko, because I am still a working Senko, is that teachers are responsible for kind of exploring, right? We come up with what we call a hypothetical diagnosis. There are plenty of kids in this country that don't have a diagnosis and will never get a diagnosis because the state, the NHS, is in. So what teachers can do is they can start to look at their toolkits, what I like to call toolkits. Most teachers will have dealt with a dyslexic child, and they will have gotten advice about how you help dyslexic children. So most of what you do for dyslexic children is you make things easier to read in the sense that you simplify them, and when you create materials, you make them easier to read. There's specific things that you can do for dyslexic children. You also associate them with pictures. Well, that sort of thing is really easy to do, and it's very helpful to do for EAL children. What happens if you can't do that enough to be able to help a child with their exams? Because again, we are under time pressure in this system. As I said before, England is an age-based system. If you're 15, you have to go to year 10. Whether you've been previously educated before, whether you're ready for your GCSEs, whether you've had difficult experiences, whatever it is, if you're 15, generally you're going into year 10. Sometimes they'll drop a kid down into year 9 to give them an extra year, but a lot of times they won't. In that case, teachers have to come up with a strategy. A visually based strategy for learning keywords is excellent. But if that child is going to sit in front of an exam and not be able to do the whole thing, then teachers have to be a bit brave. And what I've often said to teachers is that, well, you're going to choose a question. Choose a question this child is going to be able to do at GCSE level. So if you're talking about, let's say, English literature, it might be, rather than looking at something analytic, so what does Lady Macbeth represent, etc., you might look at the storyline. You might look at being able to describe a character. If that child has simple language, or they're still acquiring because they've come into the end of year 9 as a late arrival. So if you look at the tests and you prepare them for certain questions, you can give them the exam experience. You can get them, you can reduce their anxiety of them thinking that I have to know how to do, all of these questions. But again, a teacher has to be brave to be able to do that. A senior leadership team has to be brave to do that, because that is about giving that child and giving that teacher permission to not do the whole test, to be able to do some of the tests, to be able to have the educational experience, because education in this country is about tests. It's all about tests. And these kids, at some point, they have to be able to sit and examine. If you have a new arrival that comes in Key Stage 4, I say that you do put them in for their GCSEs, prepare them to do the 1 or 2 questions you're going to expect them to answer on those tests. That means they have a narrower set of language, which can be simplified. You can teach them the big topic words, but give them small sentences to write it in and teach them to answer those particular questions. And the reason I suggest that is because the joy for the educators when they see that child makes a breakthrough is not going to be yours at Key Stage 4. It's going to be at Key Stage 5. And if that goes into college as the first time, because again, we have to do GCSE English and math until you're 19 years old in this country, until you pass them. So that child is going to be seeing those exams over and over again until they pass them. At least give that child some idea of what an exam is like, so they can take that with them into their future learning and realize that you're laying the groundwork for Key Stage 5. So they're not going to be your results, but they'll be somebody else's results. Okay. More obligation does come into work here. Expanding access is about understanding the difference between what is a learning issue and what is a language issue, and then choosing a particular strategy. So, for example, those children with dyslexia or other issues where they're trying to pull together the meaning of a word with how it's spelled, with how it sounds, with what it looks like, that's a different issue than a child learning English who's trying to learn the word, and I keep using this word, photosynthesis. So if you have difficulty pulling together a sound with a visual, and you're sounding out photosynthesis, by the time you get to photosyn, because your phonological loop is impaired, and there's phonological impairment that comes with dyslexia, you will have forgotten what the beginning of that word is by the time you go forward. That's not the same for EAL children. For those of you who have seen the length of Spanish words or Turkish words or Hungarian words, these children will deal with syllabic words which are 10 syllables. You know, one of the longest words that I would teach as a Spanish teacher is desafortunadamente. That's got, I think, 10 or 11 syllables. So it's not the long words that are the problem. These kids can deal with long words. The problem for them is the sounding it out, the knowing what the concept is, and it's not the same as an SEN child. So an SEN child can't necessarily deal with photosynthesis because they can't remember all those bits of words and keep them all together in their minds. They deal with visuals. So often I find that teachers, they'll use the small words, like I said, though or about, which are really difficult to spell with EAL children, thinking, well, you can't handle the big words. No. EAL children can handle the big words. Give them the big words before you give them the little words, okay? But because of that difference, because it's the difference of linguistics versus a learning issue, the approach that you take has to be, you have to understand where the approach is that you have to take with that particular brain. The way you approach it might be the same. Visuals are my go-to because, again, you're unlocking the understanding of a concept before you give that child the word. That works with SEN kids and it works with EAL kids. It works even better with EAL kids because they have the language and they're acquiring the language and it's getting faster every day. With SEN children, they may not remember the word, they'll remember the visual. And you're trying to get that brain constantly to put together the visual with the word, visual word, right? Once the children have the word, they've got it, they're EAL, they've got the concept. Once they have the word, they'll use the word. They won't necessarily go to the visual. SEN children are different. They continue to need the visual to be able to call up the word, which is why we're constantly being told, use visuals in your teaching, okay? I spoke earlier at a panel about something called the Noun Project. Now, the Noun Project is a free website which comes up with, which has designed millions of icons for concepts. Because a lot of English teachers or humanities teachers will say, well, you know, that's fine if you're dealing with something concrete like maths or science or DT, but what about when you're dealing with justice or the self or, you know, the universe or things like that, which is very difficult to put a picture to. My answer is there are people who have already been thinking about these things and they've developed icons to help you with that. So check on the Noun Project because actually the abstract concepts that we have to teach children can be visually represented. Sometimes you have to work with that child to get them to understand the combination of visual icons. Sometimes it's not right away, and that's because of cultural differences, but you can still use the visuals to get to the language. For SEN and for EAL children, there's one thing that is the same. that if you go from text first, if you expect them to get information out of language first, that's going to be really difficult. The way the brain works, visual first, concept first, language afterwards. Always. It's always got to be that way. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about reasonable adjustments. For those of you who are teachers out there. Reasonable adjustments is an SEN concept. However, it can be used for EAL children as well. Reasonable adjustments in the lower years, so in primary school, is different from reasonable adjustments at Key Stage 4. At Key Stage 4, when we think about reasonable adjustments, we're thinking about exams. And we're thinking about the types of access arrangements that you can do for exams. Most primary schools don't know that you can also have access arrangements for the SATs. Well, we're not going to have the SATs this year, so that's kind of a new concept. But for the GCSEs, there are a number of things that you can get for EAL children. And they've changed over the past couple of years. I'm a specialist assessor, and I'm assessing children every day for these sorts of things. So they just put in a new concept for EAL children. It used to be that EAL children were only allowed 10% extra time and a bilingual dictionary to be able to go through their exams. And then what began to happen was that with the types of refugees that we had coming through and the types of unaccompanied minors as well, you had children that didn't necessarily have an education, a background, that weren't necessarily formally educated. And so those children couldn't necessarily read and write in their own language. And so giving them a bilingual dictionary and extra time didn't help because they couldn't find the words. They couldn't read their own language. So recently, the Joint Council for Qualifications, JCQ, which goes over EdXL, AQA, the Welsh Board, all the boards, decided that instead of a bilingual dictionary, that those children could go for a computer reader, which means that they can use the read aloud on Microsoft to be able to read something to them so that they can understand more of it there. Okay. And that's been really useful. That's only happened since September this year because it recognizes that actually the language that the kids pick up is social, it is visual, and in the sense that they're listening to you before they do anything else. So when they're taking an exam, being able to listen to the exam is going to unlock more access to those exams than it is just teaching them the words or giving them keyword lists, etc. So that's a good one. That means actually the exam boards have to change the type of exams that they do. Exam boards at the moment are they're delivering what they call editable PDFs. So this is now happening. EdXL History does it. AQA is a little behind the time when it comes to English language and literature, but what it is an exam where instead of the child can actually type into it as a PDF versus, typing on the computer and looking at the exam paper, right? And that PDF can also be read out loud to the child. I mean, this stuff sounds like brain surgery. This is like guns. It's not. It's the things that we should be able to be doing, that if we value these children being able to have access to their education and eventually to exams, because like I said, this is an exam-based country, then we have to be able to use a lot of this technology to be able to give them access to that. I think my time is done. I think my time is done. We've been talking for 45 minutes. And again, if you have any questions,